I was sitting alone in my farmhouse kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning when the phone rang. The trembling voice on the other end was no longer the confident son I had raised, but a broken man calling from a county jail. "Dad, I need you. My father-in-law framed me. They say I destroyed the company, but I swear I didn't." 3 simple sentences shattered 45 years of silence between us. I grabbed my truck keys without another word. Before that week was over, everyone who had betrayed my son would discover they had chosen the wrong family to destroy. If you found your way here today, I am glad you stayed. Leave a comment. Tell me your city, your country. Let me know who I am talking to. Elements of this story are fictional, crafted for the purpose of honest, meaningful storytelling. Coincidence covers the names and places. The lesson inside it does not. The quiet man. I want to tell you something about myself before I tell you anything else. I am 65 years old. I own 500 acres of wheatland outside Sheridan, Wyoming. I drive a Ford F-150 that has 187,000 miles on it, and a crack in the passenger side mirror I have been meaning to fix for 2 years. Every morning I wake up before 4, feed the horses, check the fence line, and make the worst coffee in Sheridan County on a percolator that belonged to my wife before she passed. That is what most people know about me. And for a long time, that was exactly what I wanted most people to know about me. What I am going to tell you now is the rest of it. It starts on a Monday morning in September the 16th, 2024. I remember the date the way you remember dates that split your life into before and after, even though on that particular morning I did not yet know it was going to be that kind of date. I just knew it was cold. Wyoming September cold, the kind that comes in off the Bighorn Mountains before sunrise and gets into your bones before you have had time to argue with it. I had been up since 3:30. I usually am. The wheat fields were still dark when I walked the east fence line that morning. There was a section of post that had worked itself loose in the wind the night before I could hear it, before I saw it the way a loose post has a different sound when the breeze hits it, a kind of hollow knock that does not belong. I found it, fixed it with the tools I carry in my jacket pocket out of habit, and stood there for a moment in the dark, looking at nothing in particular. I was thinking about my son. I do that most mornings. I have done it for years. Caleb is 45 years old, and he has not needed me to think about him from a distance for a long time. But I do it anyway, the way you do things that started as worry and became ritual. He was in Denver. He had been in Denver for 8 years, working at a logistics company run by his wife's family. Building something. Earning it the hard way without my name attached to any of it. I was proud of him for that. I want you to know that first. I was also afraid for him. But I had not told him that. Not once in 8 years. I walked back to the house when the sky started going gray at the edges, the particular shade of pre-dawn gray that tells you another day is actually going to happen, whether you are ready for it or not. I made coffee. I poured it into the same mug I always use, a heavy ceramic thing with a chip on the rim that Margaret would have thrown away years ago. I set 2 mugs on the table before I caught myself. That still happens. 13 years after she passed, some mornings I still set 2 mugs. I picked the second one up and put it back in the cabinet. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, in the chair that faces the window, with Margaret's photograph on the shelf to my left. She is smiling in that photograph, caught mid-laugh, actually by a camera she did not know was pointed at her, out behind the barn on a summer afternoon in 1998. She hated posed photographs. She said they made people look like they were auditioning for something. I looked at her for a moment, the way I do every morning. Something is coming, I told her. I did not know what. I just knew. 40 years of trusting my instincts in business and in life will do that to a man. You start to feel weather before it arrives. She kept smiling. That was always her answer when I worried out loud. She smiled and waited for me to work through it myself. At 7 o'clock, Pastor Owen Briggs knocked on my door. Owen is 68 years old and has been the pastor at First Methodist in Sheridan for 22 years. He is also one of perhaps 4 people on this earth I would call a genuine friend, which is a small number for a man my age, but I have always believed that friendship, like good fence posts, is better deep than numerous. Owen buried my wife. He sat with me through 3 nights that first week when I could not sleep and could not speak and could not understand how the world was still operating on its normal schedule when something that enormous had stopped. He never told me what it meant or why it had happened. He just stayed. That is worth more than most people understand. He came in, poured himself a coffee without asking. He has done that for 11 years and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "You look like you slept badly," he said. "I slept fine," I said. Owen looked at me the way he looks at people when he knows they are telling a partial truth and has decided not to press it. "How's Caleb?" he asked. I held my coffee mug for a moment. "He's doing fine," I said. Owen nodded slowly. He looked at Margaret's photograph on the shelf, then back at me. He did not say anything else about Caleb. He did not need to. Owen has known me long enough to understand that when I say someone is doing fine in a particular tone of voice, I mean I am worried about them, and I have not yet decided what to do about it. We drank our coffee. We talked about the fence situation on the north boundary, about the weather coming in from Idaho later in the week, about the Hendersons down the road, who were putting their place up for sale after 40 years. Ordinary Monday morning conversation between 2 men who have run out of the need to fill silence with noise. When Owen left at 8, I stood on the porch and watched his truck disappear down the gravel road, and then I stood there a little longer than I needed to. At 9:15, my phone rang. It was Peggy Norwood, my assistant in Denver, a woman who has worked for me for 16 years and has the particular quality which I value above almost everything in a professional context of saying exactly what she means without decoration. "Morning, Mr. Hale," she said. "Quarterly report from the Pruitt Logistics account. Their compliance filing is 30 days late, and their auditors flagged 3 discrepancies in the revenue figures. Lorraine Beckett wants to know if you want to escalate or extend the review window." Pruitt Logistics, my son's employer, my daughter-in-law's family company, a company I had extended $50 million of credit to 3 years ago on the basis of financial statements that Harlan Pruitt had signed personally. "Keep watching it, Peggy," I said. "Tell Lorraine I want a full forensic review of those discrepancies, quietly. No communication to Pruitt until I say so." "Understood," Peggy said and ended the call. I put the phone in my pocket and walked back inside. I stood in front of Margaret's photograph for a long moment, longer than usual. "I should have said something sooner," I told her. "About Vivian. About all of it. I saw things 8 years ago that I chose to let go because I told myself it was his life and his choice, and I had to respect that." She kept smiling at me from that summer afternoon in '98. I picked up my truck keys from the hook by the door. At the end of my driveway where the gravel meets the county road, I stopped the F-150 and looked south for just a moment. 250 miles south, Denver was already wide awake. My son was already at his desk. And somewhere in that city, something I could feel but not yet name was already in motion. I turned right toward town, but the feeling did not go with me when I drove away. I want you to remember that. Because in less than 72 hours, that feeling was going to have a name, and the name was going to change everything. The son who walked away. Now let me tell you about my son. Caleb Hale is 45 years old. He has his mother's eyes, that particular shade of brown that looks almost amber in certain light. And he has my jaw and my stubbornness, which I say not as a compliment to myself, but as a statement of observable fact. He is the kind of man who arrives early, stays late, and never once in his adult life has asked for something he did not believe he had earned. I do not say that because he is my son. I say it because it is true, and because understanding what kind of man Caleb is matters enormously for understanding what happened to him. Most of what I am about to tell you from this point I pieced together afterward. From what Caleb told me, from the evidence that came out in the investigation, from the things I eventually learned about the people in his life that I wish I had learned 8 years earlier. I am going to tell it to you the way I came to understand it, as a complete picture, not just the pieces I witnessed myself. On that same Monday morning, September 16th, while I was fixing fence posts in Wyoming, Caleb stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor of Pruitt Logistics at 7:45 in the morning. Same time every day for 8 years. He had a paper cup of black coffee in one hand and his laptop bag over one shoulder and 12 open items on his mental task list before he had even sat down at his desk. That was my son, always running slightly ahead of the clock, always with more to do than hours to do it in. Pruitt Logistics occupied floors 12 through 18 of a glass tower in Cherry Creek, Denver. Harlan Pruitt, my son's father-in-law. Vivian's father, a man I had met at the wedding 6 years earlier and shaken hands with and decided in the first 30 seconds that I did not fully trust, had built the company over 40 years from a regional trucking operation into a mid-sized logistics firm with contracts across 6 states. On paper, it looked solid. I knew from the quarterly reports Peggy had been flagging for me that the paper was doing a better job than the reality underneath it. But Caleb did not know that. I had not told him. That is something I have to live with. Caleb told me later that the first thing that felt wrong that Monday was Marcus Delling. Marcus Delling was the CFO of Pruitt Logistics, 48 years old, compact, precise. The kind of man who wore the same style of charcoal suit every day and appeared in doorways without knocking. He came to Caleb's desk that morning at 9 o'clock and said that Harlan wanted to restructure the payment schedule on the MED 2247 contract, push the second installment back 60 days. Now I want you to understand what MED 2247 was. It was a shipment of advanced medical imaging equipment valued at $5.2 million, bound for a hospital consortium in Colorado and Wyoming. It was the largest single contract Caleb had personally negotiated in his 3 years in that role. His name was on the relationship memo. His word was attached to the delivery schedule. The partner consortium had structured their own financing around Caleb's guarantee. And now, the morning after Caleb had spent 12 hours building a tracking system for that exact container, the CFO was at his desk, asking him to call those partners and tell them the terms were changing. Caleb told Delling he would go to Harlan directly. Delling nodded and left. Caleb said Delling did not look him in the eye when he turned to go. He noticed that. He was the kind of man who noticed things like that and filed them away. Then his sister called. Donna is 38 years old, my younger child, Caleb's sister, living in Cheyenne. She is the most straightforward person I have ever known, which is saying something given that I have spent 65 years in Wyoming, where people do not generally go in for indirection. Donna had called Caleb 3 times that month alone. Caleb told me afterward that each time he had listened for about 90 seconds before telling her she was wrong. This call was no different. Caleb, Donna said, 3 years ago I saw Vivian at a restaurant in Cheyenne with a man I didn't recognize. When I asked her about it, she lied straight to my face without blinking. I need you to know that. And Caleb, my son, the man I raised to trust his instincts, said, Donna, you've never liked Vivian. That doesn't mean she's done something wrong. And he ended the call. I asked him later after everything whether he had believed Donna or whether he had simply not wanted to believe her. He thought about it for a long time before he answered. Both, he said finally. At the same time, I think I knew she wasn't lying. I just couldn't afford to know it yet. I understood that. I had done the same thing for 8 years. That evening, Caleb went home and found Vivian working at the dining table, laptop open. When he walked in, she closed it. Not quickly, not guiltily, just smoothly, the way someone closes something they have been waiting to close. She smiled at him, asked about his day. He told her about the Delling conversation, about the payment restructure, about his plan to go to Harlan directly. She listened with her eyes on his face, and her thoughts Caleb would later understand, somewhere else entirely. She said, "Dad is just managing the quarter. It's not personal." He said, "It's my name on the contract." She said, "Come to bed at a reasonable hour and we can talk about it properly." He said he would come when he was done. He told me later that he sat at the kitchen table after she went to bed, going through the tracking documents on his laptop. And somewhere around midnight, he stopped and looked up at the ceiling and had the specific feeling that he was missing something important. Not about the container, about his life. The feeling a man gets when he realizes the map he has been using does not match the territory. He did not know yet what was missing. He went to bed. At some point in the night, Caleb was asleep. By then, Vivian's phone lit up on the nightstand. The screen glowed in the dark bedroom. Caleb was not fully asleep. He saw it from the corner of his eye. He saw the sender field before the screen went dark. A single letter, W. Vivian was awake immediately, the way someone is awake who was never fully asleep. She picked up the phone and walked out of the bedroom with it. Caleb lay in the dark and listened to her footsteps move down the hallway. He did not follow. He did not call out. He told me he made a decision in that moment to trust her, which was not. He said the same as not being afraid. He was afraid. He just chose one more time not to look at what he was afraid of. I want you to hold on to that detail. The letter W, because 6 days later, that letter was going to be the thread that started unraveling everything, and by then, Caleb would not be able to choose to look away from any of it. The missing container. The call came at 6:17 in the morning on Tuesday, September 17th. Caleb's phone. A 510 area code, Oakland, California. He told me later that he almost did not answer it because he was in the middle of reviewing the overnight tracking reports, and he did not recognize the number. But something made him pick up. 45 years of his mother's instincts living inside him, maybe. Whatever it was, he answered. The man on the other end identified himself as Dennis Okafor. I want to tell you about Dennis Okafor because he matters more to this story than most people realized at the time. Dennis was 47 years old, the senior operations manager at the Port of Oakland, a man who had spent 19 years in that job and had developed over those 19 years the kind of professional instincts that cannot be taught in any classroom. He noticed things, small things, the kind of things that most people walk past because they are not wrong enough to flag and not right enough to explain. Dennis Okafor noticed things and he kept records of what he noticed. Hail, Dennis said, and Caleb told me his voice had the particular quality of someone who has just found something they were not looking for and wishes they had not found it. We have a problem with container MED-2247, the medical equipment shipment. It left our facility 3 days ago, but it never arrived at its destination. Caleb set down everything he was holding. $5.2 million of advanced medical imaging equipment. Gone. He called Dennis back immediately on a direct line and asked for everything, every document, every log entry, every piece of paper or digital record connected to that container from the moment it had entered the Oakland facility. Dennis told him what he had already found. The container had been logged out on Saturday night, September 14th, under an internal authorization email sent from the Pruitt logistics system at 11:47 p.m. The destination listed was a warehouse address in Stockton, California. The timestamp on that email is what got my attention, Dennis told Caleb. We get hundreds of shipping instructions every week. I cannot tell you why I printed that one out. I just did. 11:47 at night, something about it felt wrong enough to keep. That printed copy of the email kept in a manila folder in Dennis Okafor's desk drawer, out of nothing more than a 20-year professional instinct, was going to become one of the most important pieces of evidence in a federal fraud case. But neither of them knew that yet on Tuesday morning. What Caleb knew was that the warehouse address in Stockton did not match any facility in the Pruitt Logistics partner network. He searched it 3 different ways and came up with nothing registered. The container was not there. It was not anywhere in the tracking system. $5.2 million of medical equipment had walked out of Oakland on a Saturday night and vanished. He told me his hands were shaking when he called Dennis back the second time. Not from cold. From the specific physical sensation of understanding that something very large has gone wrong and that your name is attached to it. "Dennis," he said, "the authorization email, do you have the sender's IP address in your system logs?" Dennis said he would check. He asked Caleb to hold. While Caleb held, he pulled up the internal Pruitt Logistics records for that Saturday night. The email authorizing the container release had originated from within the Pruitt system. That meant someone with internal access had sent it. Someone with the right credentials. He started running through who had access to the shipping authorization system. The list was not long. Harlan, Marcus Delling, Caleb himself, and Vivian. Because Caleb had added her access credentials 3 days earlier, on the evening he stayed late building the tracking system, because he wanted the investigation team to be able to work without him if necessary. A completely routine professional decision. The kind of thing you do without thinking, because you trust the people you are working with. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My son gave her the key. Not because he was careless. Because he trusted her. Because in 8 years of marriage he had never had a reason that he allowed himself to see not to. Dennis came back on the line. The IP address from the email log, it does not match any device registered to Pruitt Logistics headquarters. It came from an external connection. I can give you the address. Yes, Caleb said. Give it to me. He wrote it down. He did not know yet what address it would lead to. That would come later when Frank and the FBI ran it through their systems. But he wrote it down and he held on to it. Dennis said something else then that Caleb told me he has never forgotten. Mr. Hale, before you call anyone inside your company about this, I need you to think carefully about who you trust. Because the release was authorized from inside your system. And whoever did it knew exactly which process to use and exactly what time to use it. A pause on the line. I have been in this industry for 19 years. What I am looking at right now does not feel like a mistake. It feels like a plan. Caleb did not call Harlan that morning. He did not call Marcus Delling. He went into his office, closed the door, and spent the next 14 hours going through every log he could access, building a timeline entry by entry, cross-referencing timestamps, mapping every point where the trail either held or broke. And late that night, after everyone else had gone home and the 14th floor was dark and quiet, he made one decision that he thought was practical and turned out to be the most important thing he did all week. He set his tracking system to send automatic backups to a personal cloud account. Every hour on the hour. Everything he had built, everything he had documented, copied and stored somewhere that was not the Pruitt Logistics server. He did not know why he did it. He told me it just felt necessary. Like printing out an email at 11:47 at night because something feels wrong enough to keep. He turned off his desk lamp, picked up his bag, and walked to the elevator. He pressed the button and waited, and the hallway camera above his desk recorded him walking away. What that same camera recorded 40 minutes later, after the building had fully emptied and the motion sensors had cycled through their idle state, was something Caleb did not know about until the FBI showed him the footage 3 weeks later. A figure stepped off the elevator and walked to Caleb's desk. Sat down in his chair. The angle of the camera and the darkness of the hallway made full identification impossible from that footage alone. But the figure moved with purpose and familiarity, someone who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they were going to do when they got there. They sat at my son's desk for 23 minutes. Then they stood up, walked back to the elevator, and were gone. I have thought about those 23 minutes many times since I learned about them. 23 minutes in the dark at my son's desk, using his credentials, his access, his name, building a trap out of everything he had given them freely because he trusted them. 23 minutes. That is all it took to destroy 12 years of what he had built. And he was home asleep when it happened, lying next to the person who was doing it. The architect. The events I am about to describe did not happen after the arrest. They happened before it, months before, in rooms I never entered, and conversations I was never meant to know about. I am placing them here out of sequence because without them, the rest of this story does not make sense. To understand what happened to Caleb, you need to go back 6 months. I am going to take you there now, because without it, the rest of this story does not make the kind of sense that lets you see the full shape of what was done to my son. This is the part that took me the longest to be able to tell, without my voice doing something I do not want it to do. But I promised myself I would tell this whole thing honestly, and that means telling this part too. What I am about to describe comes from 3 sources: the testimony Harlan Pruitt gave to federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, the cooperation agreement Wade Pruitt signed after his arrest, and the forensic evidence recovered from Vivian's private accounts and devices. I did not witness any of this myself, but by the time the investigation was complete, I knew it as well as if I had been sitting in the room. Tuesday evening, March 19th, 2024. A bar in the northwest suburbs of Denver, the kind of place chosen specifically because nobody who knew either of them would be there. Corner booth, low-lighting music loud enough to make the conversation private without requiring anyone to lean in. Vivian Pruitt Hale arrived first. She ordered sparkling water. She placed a white envelope on the table and did not touch it again. When Wade Pruitt slid into the booth across from her, she pushed the envelope toward him without greeting him. Just slid it across the table with 2 fingers and said, "Open it." Now, Wade Pruitt. Let me tell you who Wade was because I think it matters. Wade was 38 years old, Vivian's younger brother, and had spent most of those 38 years living in the considerable shadow his sister cast, without apparently noticing that the shadow was not warmth. He was lean and restless, the kind of man who is always between things, between jobs, between cities, between decisions. He had their father's jaw, and none of their father's patience, and he had his sister's intelligence in the same way that a copy has the shape of an original without its resolution. Sharp enough to understand what was being asked of him. Not sharp enough to fully understand what it was going to cost. He opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000. Wade looked at the check. He looked at his sister. She was watching him with the expression of someone waiting for a piece of machinery to engage, patient, technical, entirely without sentiment. She laid it out for him, the way an engineer lays out a blueprint. Container MED2247A medical equipment shipment, valued at $5.2 million, was going to disappear in transit. Wade had contacts in the Oakland Port network, people who operated in the space between official procedure and private arrangement. Those contacts would facilitate the physical removal of the container and its contents to a secondary buyer. Wade's cut for coordinating this would be $800,000 paid in 3 installments after completion. The remaining money after the port contact's fee and Wade's payment would go into an account in the Cayman Islands. An account held under a trust structure registered in the name of a woman who had been dead for 5 years. And the insurance claim, Wade asked. Filed within 72 hours of the container going missing, Vivian said. $5.2 million, standard freight loss, fully documented. That money goes to Pruitt Logistics. She picked up her sparkling water and looked at it. The claim goes to Pruitt Logistics, she said. The question of where the money ultimately flows is a separate conversation. Wade sat with that for a moment. He was not entirely without instinct. I give him that much credit looking back. He understood that she had answered his question by not answering it. He understood that the insurance money was not going to the company in any meaningful sense. "What does Dad know?" he asked. And this is the part that told me everything I needed to know about what kind of person Vivian Pruitt-Hale truly was. "Dad knows we have a cash flow crisis and that I am working on a solution," she said. "He does not know the specifics. He will not know the specifics. What Dad needs is for this problem to go away. He does not need to understand the mechanism." She used her own father as a shield. She kept him ignorant specifically so that his ignorance would protect her, and so that if anything went wrong, he would be positioned as a victim rather than a participant. Harlan Pruitt was not an innocent man in this story, but he was not the architect of it either. He was a man who asked fewer questions than he should have, because the answers frightened him, and who discovered too late that willful blindness carries its own kind of guilt. Wade nodded. He put the check in his jacket pocket. At the door he stopped and turned back. "Caleb," he said. Not a question exactly. More like a name laid on the table to see what she would do with it. Vivian looked at her brother for a long moment. "Caleb's credentials are what makes this work," she said. "His access, his reputation, his signature on the relationship memo. When the container goes missing and the investigation begins, the trail will lead to the account. He uses the system. He operates the authorizations that carry his name. He is the most credible person in that building." She paused. "That is precisely why it has to look like him." Wade left. I have replayed that sentence in my mind more times than I can count. He is the most credible person in that building. That is precisely why it has to look like him. She used the best thing about my son, his integrity, his reputation, 12 years of honest work, as the instrument of his destruction. She spent 8 years, our family, learning the shape of Caleb's character, and then she used that knowledge to build a cage out of it. Now let me take you back to the night of September 17th. While Caleb was in his car in the parking garage below Pruitt Logistics, calling Vivian to say he would be home late while she said okay, and hung up in 3 seconds, which he noticed, but did not question. She was already moving. She drove to an address in Cherry Creek that Caleb did not know existed. An apartment she had leased privately 14 months earlier under a separate arrangement that appeared on no joint financial document and no shared account. She had used it in the early months for planning spreadsheets, account structures, the Cayman Trust documentation, and later as the operational base for everything that followed. She let herself in, opened her laptop, and used the access credentials Caleb had given her 48 hours ago as a gesture of professional trust. She worked for 23 minutes. She deleted the shipping log entries that would have shown the correct timeline. She inserted 3 emails into Caleb's account history that appeared to authorize a payment rerouting scheme with a Pruitt partner company. She did this without speed and without hesitation, the way someone does a thing they have been rehearsing for months. When she was done, she closed the laptop. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk and removed a manila envelope. Inside it were divorce papers, fully completed, every field filled in notarized 3 weeks earlier. She looked at them for a moment. Then she put them back. Not yet, but soon. The Perfect Betrayal, Thursday morning, September 19th, 2024. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened that day. I was in Wyoming. I was fixing a water pump on the south end of the property when my phone rang at 9 in the morning, and it was Peggy. And she said something that made me put down every tool I was holding and walk to my truck and sit in the driver's seat without starting the engine for a long time. But that comes later. First, let me tell you what Caleb walked into. He stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor at 7:45 in the morning, same as always. Coffee in hand, laptop bag over one shoulder. His mind was already running through the Oakland timeline, the IP address Dennis had given him, the tracking documentation he had backed up to his personal cloud the night before. He was building a case in his head, piece by piece, the same way he had always worked, methodical, thorough, starting from what he knew and working outward. He was 3 steps from the elevator when he stopped. 3 men in dark suits were standing in the open office space. Behind them, 2 uniformed Denver police officers. The men in suits had the particular stillness of people trained to project authority by not moving, and every person on the 14th floor had gone very quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when something has already been decided and they are waiting to see who it has been decided about. The man in the center stepped forward. He was 45 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been professionally trained to reveal nothing it did not choose to reveal. He produced a federal badge and held it where Caleb could read every detail. Mr. Hale, Special Agent Curtis Webb, FBI Denver Field Office. We have a federal search warrant for these premises and for your personal workstation. I need you to step away from your desk and come with me. Curtis Webb. I want to say something about Webb because the way I talk about him in this part of the story is going to be different from the way I talk about him later, and I think you should know that going in. At this moment, on this morning, Webb believed he had the right man. He was doing his job the way a serious federal agent does his job, following evidence, executing a warrant, making an arrest. What he did not yet know was that the evidence he had been following had been constructed specifically to lead him to my son. Webb was not Vivian's accomplice. He was her instrument. There is a difference. And he is the one, to his credit, who understood that difference first once the real picture started to emerge. But on Thursday morning, he was walking toward my son with handcuffs. Wire fraud. Under federal law, specifically 18 United States Code Section 1343, using electronic communications to carry out a scheme to defraud is a serious felony. The FBI handles these cases directly because they cross state lines and involve federal financial systems. The evidence Webb had in front of him that morning showed authorization codes sent from Caleb's account, emails routed through Caleb's credentials, a pattern that pointed cleanly and completely at one person. Webb had a warrant. He was not wrong to use it. He was just looking at a picture that had been painted by someone who understood exactly how investigators think. Caleb told me he did not raise his voice, did not pull back, did not do any of the things a guilty man might do when cornered, or any of the things an innocent man might do when terrified. He stood very still and said, "This is wrong. I did not do this." 2 sentences, quiet and direct. And then he said, "I need to call my attorney." Webb told him he would have that opportunity. The forensic imaging team agents carrying hard-sided cases with equipment designed to make an exact copy of a computer's hard drive without altering any files moved to Caleb's workstation. This is standard federal procedure in fraud investigations. Preserve the evidence exactly as it exists before anyone can change it. It is the right thing to do. It is also in this case exactly what Vivian had counted on. She needed those files to be preserved. She had put them there herself. What happened next is the part that still makes me set my jaw when I think about it. Caleb told me he was standing near the elevator with Agent Webb's hand on his arm when he looked across the 14th floor and saw them. Harlan Pruitt standing near the glass conference room with his arms crossed, and beside him, Vivian. She was dressed beautifully. Her expression was the expression of a wife in distress, eyes bright with what anyone watching would read as tears held back, one hand pressed to her collarbone, head tilted forward slightly. She had performed grief and worry so precisely that the performance looked like the real thing. It was the real thing in the sense that it was the best version of itself. I say that not to defend her. I say it because I think it matters to understand just how deliberate all of this was. She met Caleb's eyes across the room. Caleb told me that what he saw in her eyes was not fear. It was not sorrow. It was assessment. She was checking whether the plan had held, looking at the evidence of her own work the way an engineer checks a calculation. That was the moment he said that he stopped understanding the last 8 years and started understanding them differently. Both things happened at the same time, and the second understanding hurt in a way the first never had, because it meant the first had never been real. They walked him to the elevator. The doors closed. Downstairs in the lobby, a woman named Jenna Albright was already there with a camera crew. Jenna was an investigative journalist with the Denver Post who had been covering financial irregularities in Colorado's logistics sector for the better part of a year. She had received a tip that morning about the FBI action, a tip that, as the investigation later confirmed, had been arranged the previous evening through an intermediary connected to the Pruitt family communications team. She had been invited to witness my son's arrest. She had been given front-row access to the moment of his public destruction. She was doing her job. I do not blame her for that either. She did not know what she was being used for. Not yet. Among the crowd of employees gathered in the lobby, watching Caleb be walked out in handcuffs to a waiting federal vehicle, was a woman named Elena Vasquez. Elena was 34 years old, a warehouse operations coordinator who had worked for Pruitt Logistics for 6 years. She had never done anything wrong. She had never falsified a document, never looked the other way when she should have looked straight, never signed her name to anything she did not believe. She stood in that lobby and watched what was happening to Caleb Hale with the expression of someone who knows something is deeply wrong but does not yet have the words or the standing to say so. 1 hour after Caleb was taken away, Elena received an email from Pruitt Logistics HR, terminated effective immediately. Reason: failure to report known irregularities. She had not known about any irregularities. She had never been told about any irregularities. She was fired because she had been in the building, because she had a face and a name and a file, and because someone needed a secondary narrative that suggested the problem was systemic and that multiple people had looked away. Elena Vasquez was collateral damage in someone else's calculation, and I think about that whenever I think about what kind of people were willing to do what they did. At Denver County Jail, Caleb was processed, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. His belt, his watch, his wallet, his phone all removed. His Miranda rights were read to him in the flat, practiced tone of someone who reads them 40 times a week. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. He said he understood. An hour later, a corrections officer unlocked the cell and told him he had a legal delivery waiting at processing. At the booking desk, a staff attorney from Vivian's law firm had checked in 10 minutes after Caleb was processed. They had moved that fast, which told him everything he needed to know about how long those papers had been ready. The envelope was handed to him across the counter. His name was written on the front in handwriting he would have recognized in the dark. He opened it. Divorce papers, fully completed, notarized, dated that morning. Caleb told me he sat on the metal bench in that holding cell and read every line of those papers twice. His hands were completely still. Not from calm, from the specific paralysis that comes when the thing you were most afraid might be true turns out to be true, and the fear converts into something colder and much heavier. He did not sign them. He told me later it was not because he hoped for anything. It was because he refused to let 8 years of his life be resolved by a document delivered through a jail cell slot by a woman who had already decided he did not exist. He folded the envelope and set it aside, and then he lay back on that metal bench and stared at the ceiling and waited for a night that was going to be the longest of his life. The darkest night. I did not sleep that Thursday night. I want to tell you that first because I think it matters. I did not know what was happening to Caleb. Peggy had called me that morning. The call I mentioned earlier, the one that made me put down my tools and sit in my truck without starting the engine. And she had told me that FBI agents had executed a search warrant at Pruitt Logistics and that one individual had been taken into custody. She did not have a name yet. She was working on it. I did not need a name. I knew. I spent that day doing the only thing I know how to do when I am afraid and cannot yet act. I worked. I fixed the water pump. I replaced 3 fence posts on the south boundary. I drove to Sheridan for hardware supplies I did not need and came back and stacked them in the barn. I fed the horses at their usual time. I made dinner I did not eat. I sat in the kitchen with Margaret's photograph and the percolator running and my phone face up on the table, and I waited. By 9 o'clock that night, I had confirmed what I already knew. Peggy called back. The individual taken into custody was Caleb Hale. Wire fraud, insurance fraud, taken to Denver County Jail. I set the phone down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you do not want anyone, even yourself, to see that. Then I picked it up again and started to dial his number. Then I remembered his phone had been taken at booking. I set it down again. I sat in that kitchen for a long time. Now let me tell you what Caleb was doing while I sat in that kitchen. He told me all of this later in pieces over several conversations. Some of it he could tell straightforwardly. Some of it took him longer to get to. I am putting it together here the way a picture gets assembled, starting with the edges and working inward. The fluorescent light in the holding cell never turned off. That was the first thing Caleb said. The light. A steady buzzing, entirely indifferent light that made no distinction between 2 in the afternoon and 2 in the morning, that turned every hour into the same hour, that removed the ordinary mercy of darkness from a place that had very little mercy to spare. He had been in that cell since mid-afternoon. By 11 at night, his body had lost track of time entirely. He lay on the metal bench with one arm over his eyes to block the light and went through the last 8 years the way you go through a room after something has been stolen, not looking for what is there, but for what is missing, for the gaps, for the places where something should be and is not. He found them, more than he wanted to find. The times Vivian had closed her laptop when he entered a room. The phone calls she took in other rooms. The way she had over years, very gradually, very gently created distance between Caleb and Donna, finding small reasons why Donna's visits were inconvenient, letting silences grow between calls until Donna was calling, and Caleb was not calling back, until the gap between brother and sister was wide enough that Caleb's isolation was complete without ever feeling imposed. He told me he understood lying on that bench how long it had taken, how patient she had been. That was the thing that cut deepest. I think not the betrayal itself, but the discovery of how much time and care had gone into it. 8 years. She had spent 8 years. Around 1 in the morning he got up. He walked to the corner of the cell and put his forehead against the concrete wall. The wall was cold and rough and entirely real in a way that the last 8 years had just stopped being. He stood there for a while. Then he pulled his fist back and hit the wall. Once, twice. Not from rage, he told me. He said it was not anger in the way people usually mean anger. It was more like needing something solid to push back against him, needing proof that the world still had edges, that he was still a physical thing in a physical place, and not just a name on a fraud indictment, dissolving into whatever came next. His knuckles split on the third impact. He felt the warmth of it before he felt the pain, and then he felt the pain, and he slid down the wall and sat on the floor with his back against the concrete and held his hand against his chest and breathed. A duty officer passed during rounds, saw him on the floor. Did not say a word, just reached through the bars and set a folded piece of cloth on the floor beside him. A strip of fabric from somewhere. The small, wordless gesture of a person doing a humane thing in a place that does not always make humane things easy. Caleb rapped his knuckles. He stayed on the floor for a while longer. At some point, he got up and went back to the bench and lay down again. The light buzzed on. He thought about Donna, who had called 3 times that month and been told each time that she was wrong. He thought about the vantage point he was at, now the view from this particular bench in this particular cell, and how clearly he could see from here what he had refused to see from everywhere else. How obvious it all was. How much easier it would have been to let himself see it sooner. He thought about me. He told me later that he spent a long time lying on that bench deciding whether to make the call. Not because he was uncertain about whether he wanted to, he was not uncertain about that. But because calling me meant admitting something he had spent 45 years not admitting, which was that he could not fix this alone and that he needed his father. For a man raised by Conrad Hale, that is not a small thing to admit. I say that knowing it is a reflection on me as much as on him. At 3 in the morning, he got up. He walked to the phone bank at the end of the corridor. He stood in front of the phone for long enough that the duty officer glanced over twice. Then he picked up the receiver and dialed the number he had memorized at 8 years old and never once needed to look up. At Hale Ranch, my phone rang on the kitchen table. I picked it up before the second ring. I had been sitting there for 4 hours. Hello? My voice came out level. I do not know how. There was a sound on the other end of the line that I am not going to describe in detail because it belongs to my son and not to this story in the way that everything else belongs to this story. It was the sound of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally found the one place where they do not have to hold it anymore. Then his voice, wrecked and quiet and absolutely certain of what it needed. Dad. A pause. I need you. 3 words. In 45 years, my son had never said those 3 words to me. And in the silence after them, sitting in my kitchen in Wyoming at 3 in the morning, with Margaret's photograph on the shelf and the percolator gone cold, I understood that everything I had spent my life building was for exactly this moment. Not for the company, not for the money, for this. I hear you, son, I said. I'm coming. I was out the door in 4 minutes. 3 words. I want to tell you something about that drive. 250 miles from Sheridan to Denver, on I-25 in the middle of the night, is not a short distance. It is 3.5 hours if you obey the speed limit, which I did not. I had the F-150 at 85 for most of the first hour, before I noticed the needle, and made a deliberate decision not to look at it again. Wyoming state troopers know my truck. They would have recognized it and waved me through. But I did not want to stop for any reason, not even a friendly one. I need you to understand what I was feeling in that truck. I have been asked about it since. People want to know if I was frightened or furious or heartbroken or some combination of the 3. The honest answer is that I was none of those things exactly, and all of them in a way that did not have room to be any one thing specifically. There was a boy, and I call him a boy not to diminish him, but because that is how he lives. In my chest, always, regardless of how old he gets, there was a boy sitting in a jail cell in Denver because someone had spent 8 years inside my family learning how to destroy him. And I had known 8 years ago that something was wrong, and I had said nothing. I drove with both hands on the wheel and did not let myself think about that for long. There would be time for that later. Right now, there was only the road and the work. I called Lorraine Beckett at 3:47 in the morning. Lorraine Beckett has been the chief executive officer of Vance Capital for 11 years. Before that, she spent 12 years as my chief financial officer. And before that, she was the sharpest analyst in a Denver investment firm that no longer exists because most of its best people eventually left to work somewhere that Lorraine Beckett was running. She is 55 years old, precise, and has the particular quality I value most in the people who work with me, which is the ability to hear a complicated situation, described quickly, and understand it completely without requiring it to be repeated. She also answers her phone at 3:47 in the morning, without complaint, which I have always considered a sign of exceptional professional character. "Lorraine," I said, "Caleb has been arrested. Federal fraud charges. He did not do it. I need Storm Protocol activated tonight." I should explain what Storm Protocol is because it sounds more dramatic than it actually is. It is simply a set of pre-arranged procedures I established years ago for situations where a company in Vance Capital's portfolio needed to be brought to account quickly. Every significant loan agreement Vance Capital extends contains what is called an acceleration clause, a provision that allows us to call in the full balance of a loan immediately rather than on its normal schedule if the borrower is found to have committed fraud in connection with the loan application or any subsequent financial reporting. The Pruitt Logistics credit facility was $50 million. Harlan Pruitt had signed personal financial statements when the loan was extended 3 years ago. Those statements, as our forensic team had already begun flagging to Lorraine over the previous weeks, did not accurately represent his actual financial position. Under Section 14 of our loan agreement, that constituted material misrepresentation. Under the terms of that same section, it waived the standard 30-day cure period and allowed immediate acceleration. In plain language, the moment our forensic accountants confirmed the discrepancies in Harlan's statements, Vance Capital had the legal right to demand the full $50 million back, immediately, without warning, and to take receivership of Pruitt Logistics assets if payment was not made. "Activate the acceleration clause," I told Lorraine. "Get the forensic team into Pruitt Logistics records tonight. I want Theodore Marsh on the first available flight to Denver. And call Agent Webb at FBI Denver. Tell him Conrad Hale needs to speak with him before sunrise." There was a pause of approximately 2 seconds, which for Lorraine represents a complete assessment of the situation. "Understood," she said. "It will be done." A brief pause. "Conrad, are you driving right now?" "Yes." "How fast?" "Faster than I should be," I said. "Everything I told you tonight, Lorraine. Not morning." "Tonight," she confirmed. She ended the call. I kept driving. The Wyoming dark, at 4 in the morning, is a specific and total thing that I do not think can be fully communicated to someone who has not experienced it. No ambient light from cities, no glow on the horizon from anything. Just the headlights cutting a white corridor into absolute black, the stars overhead so dense they look solid, and the sound of the engine and the road, and nothing else. I have driven this stretch of highway hundreds of times in my life. That night, it felt like driving through the inside of something, rather than across the surface of it. I called Frank Shepard at 3:51. Frank is 50 years old and spent 18 years as a detective with the Denver Police Department before leaving to run his own investigations firm. He is the kind of man who has seen enough of the human capacity for cruelty and the human capacity for resilience that he is surprised by, neither which makes him exceptionally good at his work. We have been friends for 22 years. He answers calls at 4 in the morning the same way he answers calls at noon without ceremony. "Frank," I said, "my son is in Denver County Jail. He did not do what they are charging him with. I need everything you can get on Pruitt Logistics, a missing container out of Oakland, and a woman named Vivian Pruitt Hale." I paused. "Tonight." "Already working it," Frank said. "Jenna Albright ran the story on the 11 o'clock news. I've been at my desk since midnight." He paused. "Conrad, there is something you need to know about the port manager in Oakland. Dennis Okafor. He kept his own records separate from what he gave to the FBI. He has footage access logs, things that did not go through official channels. He is waiting to see how the Bureau handles the initial case before he decides who gets the full picture." I gripped the wheel. "Can you get to him?" "I am booked on a 5 a.m. flight to Oakland," Frank said. "I will have everything he has before noon." "Good," I said. One more thing, Frank. Yeah, my son called me tonight for the first time in his life and told me he needed me. I said it the way I say things that matter quietly, without decoration. I want the people who put him in that position to understand, before this is finished, what that phone call cost everyone involved. Frank was quiet for a moment. He is not a man who goes quiet easily. Understood, he said. I kept driving. The miles went under the truck one after another, and with each mile the distance between me and my son got smaller, and with each mile the thing I had been carrying since I said nothing 8 years ago at a wedding in a vineyard got heavier in a way that was also somehow a relief. Because I was finally moving, finally doing the one thing I should have done years earlier, which was refuse to let the people who wanted to use my family for their own purposes believe for one more day that they could. Lorraine called back at 4:23. Storm protocol is active, she said. Forensic team is in the Pruitt records now. Theodore lands in Denver at 5:45. And Conrad Agent Webb says he has been watching Pruitt Logistics for 3 weeks already. He has things to tell you. I processed that. 3 weeks. Webb had been watching for 3 weeks before any of this came to a head, which meant there was a picture forming that was larger than what had been presented in the arrest warrant, which meant that my son was not the only thing that investigation was going to find when it finished finding things. I pressed the accelerator down another fraction. Denver was 2 hours ahead of me. The sky over the mountains to my left was still completely dark. But somewhere behind me, somewhere I could not see, yet the edge of it was thinking about changing. I arrived in Denver at 6:53 in the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at the dashboard clock when I pulled into the parking structure below Vance Capitol Tower, and numbers attach themselves to certain moments, the way scars attach themselves to skin, permanent, specific, impossible to separate from what caused them. 6:53. Wyoming mud still on my boots. 3.5 hours of I-25 still in my hands. Lorraine was already in the 32nd floor conference room with Theodore Marsh and 3 forensic accountants. She looked up when I walked in and said nothing about my flannel shirt or the hour. 11 years of partnership teaches a person which things do not need to be said. Theodore stood when I entered. 52 years old, lean and deliberate. The particular calm of a man who has spent 3 decades in federal courtrooms and understands that volume is rarely the most powerful thing in a room. He had flown in from New York on the 5:15. His briefcase was open. His annotations covered every page. Harlan Pruitt's net asset position at loan origination was declared at $47 million, he said, before I had fully sat down. The actual figure after 3 undisclosed entities and a separate personal guarantee is closer to $9 million. Fraudulent and intentional. Section 14 applies. We can file immediate acceleration and a concurrent receivership motion this morning. He slid the flagged document across the table. I read the relevant section. Then I looked at Lorraine. File both, I said. Now. Theodore was already reaching for his phone. The detention hearing was at 7 a.m. Theodore had filed the third-party custodian application at 5:30, my financial position, my Wyoming property, my clean record, my name on a document committing to produce my son at every required proceeding. I want to explain what that means under federal law. A third-party custodian assumes legal responsibility for the defendant's appearance. If Caleb had violated a single condition, the consequences would have fallen on me directly. I signed without hesitation. Judge Beverly Ashton reviewed the application for 4 minutes. I counted. Then she granted release under 3 conditions: passport surrender within 24 hours, electronic monitoring, no contact with witnesses or co-subjects. 15 minutes later, Caleb came through the side door. Same clothes from Thursday. Right hand wrapped at the knuckles. When his eyes found me across the room, they carried the look of someone who has been in the dark long enough to distrust the light. I walked to the railing. He came to me. I put both arms around my son and held on for 3 seconds, my jaw locked, my eyes burning, and I was not a billionaire or a strategist. I was just his father. Then I pulled back and put both hands on his face. "You did not do this," I said. "I know you did not do this. Before this week is finished, everyone else will know it too." He nodded once, hard, solid. Outside, my phone showed Lorraine's message acceleration notice served to Pruitt Logistics. Then a second message: Harlan Pruitt had called a press conference for 9 a.m. blaming Caleb for everything. "We need to make a stop," I said. Caleb looked at me. "Where?" I walked toward the F-150. "You'll see," I said. "Before I walk into that building, I want to know if you are still with me. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. That is all. Just 9. It tells me you are here, and that matters to me more than you know." A note before we continue. Portions of this story include fictional elements crafted to serve the telling. If that is not something you wish to hear, this is a comfortable place to stop, no judgment, and thank you for being here this long. I told Caleb to wait in the truck. He did not like that. He turned to look at me when I pulled into the Pruitt Logistics parking structure, and the look asked a question without words. I explained it simply. His release conditions prohibited contact with anyone identified as a potential witness or co-subject. Harlan and Vivian were both inside that building. One violation, and we were back in front of Judge Ashton before noon. He understood. He did not like it, but he understood. There was a second reason I did not say out loud. What I was about to do was cold work, and I was not ready for my son to see that side of me before he had recovered enough to understand it in context. I went upstairs alone. The 18th floor had been arranged as a proper press briefing chairs in rows, a podium with the Pruitt Logistics logo camera lights positioned. Harlan was behind the side door rehearsing a statement his attorneys had crafted overnight. Jenna Albright sat in the second row recorder, running uninvited and unbothered by that fact. She saw me come in and her expression sharpened immediately. I walked to the center of the room and stopped. The room registered me the way rooms register disruptions, a ripple moving outward, heads turning, conversations stopping. Lorraine Beckett and Theodore Marsh entered behind me. Agent Webb followed with 2 additional FBI agents. Harlan came through the side door, moving toward the podium. He was halfway there when he saw me. He stopped. "Conrad." His voice came out a full register lower than he intended. "Harlan." I kept my voice level. "Don't stop on my account." He reached for his authority the way a drowning man reaches for a rope. "This is a private company event. Theodore Marsh sent formal notice of default on the $50 million credit facility at 6:47 this morning," I said. "Under Section 9 of the loan covenant, the primary creditor holds right of reasonable access during a default event. I am the primary creditor. This is reasonable access." Lorraine moved to the podium with the smooth authority of someone who considers a press conference a minor technical challenge. She set aside Harlan's materials and opened her own folder. "Vance Capital hereby calls immediate acceleration of the $50 million credit facility extended to Pruitt Logistics," she said. "Effective 6 a.m. this morning, all operating accounts are frozen. Agent Webb is present to execute federal search warrants in connection with wire fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy." The room erupted. 6 journalists talking simultaneously. Camera lights swinging. Harlan standing with his prepared statement still in his hand and nowhere useful to direct it. I looked at him directly. "You used my son to save yourself," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. There is no version of this story that ends the way you planned it. That was when I saw Vivian near the window. Positioned there deliberately, the dutiful daughter, the grieving wife, dressed and composed for a role that had just stopped being available. "You should call your attorney today," I told her. "Not tomorrow. Today." I walked out. In the parking structure, Caleb was leaning against the F-150, with his arms crossed, eyes on the entrance ramp. When he saw me, he straightened immediately. "Well," he said. "Get in," I said. "Frank has something for us." As I backed out, I caught Pruitt Logistics in the side mirror, glass doors, lobby lights, a building that had stopped belonging to Harlan Pruitt at 6 a.m. 2 floors above Vivian was already composing a message to her brother. 3 seconds, then the building was gone. While I was in Denver dealing with the Pruitt press conference, Frank Shepard was in Oakland following money. I took his call sitting in the F-150 in a parking lot near the federal courthouse, while Caleb ate the first real meal he had eaten in 24 hours at a diner across the street. I want to tell it to you the way Frank told it to me, piece by piece, the way a careful man lays out evidence when he knows the weight of what he is carrying. Frank landed at Oakland International at 11 a.m. Dennis Okafor met him at the port operations office, a fluorescent-lit room smelling of coffee and diesel, a place where real work happened rather than where it was discussed. Dennis had been sitting on a complete parallel record since the night Caleb called him, waiting to see which direction the investigation would move before deciding who to trust with all of it. He trusted Frank. He handed over everything. The authorization email sent at 11:47 p.m. on September 14th had an IP address preserved in the port's automatic logging system. Frank ran it immediately. I want to explain why IP addresses matter in a fraud case. Every device connecting to the internet carries a numerical identifier that is recorded whenever it accesses a system, the digital equivalent of a fingerprint. Whoever sent that email had routed it through a VPN, virtual private network, that masks the true origin of a connection. But the VPN service used that night retained connection logs for 90 days. Webb's team had subpoenaed those records that morning. The records traced back to a residential internet account in Cherry Creek, Denver. Lorraine's forensic team had already flagged a private apartment lease in Cherry Creek, held by Vivian Pruitt Hale. The IP address matched the apartment exactly. She had sent that email from a private apartment my son did not know existed, leased 14 months before the container disappeared. She had been planning this for at least 14 months. The second piece came from Webb's Financial Crimes Unit, working simultaneously in Denver. They traced an outbound wire transfer of $4.1 million from a Pruitt Logistics subsidiary account, moved on September 15th through 3 intermediary banks in Nevada, Florida, and the Cayman Islands. Under 18 United States Code Section 1956, that multi-hop routing constitutes money laundering, moving criminal proceeds through multiple jurisdictions to obscure their origin. The final destination was a numbered Cayman Islands account, held under a trust registered to a woman named Claire Mercer. Claire Mercer had died in 2019. She was Vivian's maternal aunt. Vivian had used her dead aunt's identity to open a foreign financial account. Identity fraud layered on wire fraud, layered on insurance fraud, layered on money laundering. Every additional charge a wall she had built around herself with her own hands. The remaining $1.1 million had been withdrawn in cash from ATMs in Las Vegas, Miami, and New York. The timestamps matched Wade Pruitt's travel records precisely. "There is one more thing," Frank said. "Tell me, between 9:15 and 9:45 this morning, Vivian made 2 international calls. One to a Nassau bank, one to a Miami travel agency specializing in private international itineraries." He paused. That second call lasted 11 minutes. I looked through the diner window at Caleb back against the wall the way I taught him as a boy, a habit he had kept without knowing why. Something settled in my chest. Not satisfaction. The specific solidity of a structure coming fully clear. "She's planning to run," I said. "That is Webb's read," Frank said. "And mine." There is something else. Webb's team followed Wade from the Pruitt building this morning. He drove to a storage facility in Aurora. Inside 40 minutes. He came out carrying 2 bags he had not brought in. Wade was moving things, getting ready to go. "Whatever Webb needs to accelerate the warrant process," I said. "Tell him he has it." "He knows," Frank said. "He is already working on it." I ended the call and watched Caleb through the diner window. He looked like a man beginning to understand that the ground under him was not going to give way after all. Vivienne had 11 minutes on the phone with a travel agency. It was not going to be enough time. Before I reveal what was on that USB drive, comment the number 11 below. Tell me you are still here. Because the people who stay for this part are the ones who understand what this story is really about. One thing worth saying, portions of what follows are shaped by fiction built carefully around a message worth carrying. If you would rather not continue, this is your moment to choose, and either way, I am grateful you came this far. I want to tell you something about the moment a guilty man decides he has had enough of being afraid. Frank called me at 1:47 that Friday afternoon. I was sitting in a leather chair on the 32nd floor of Vance Capitol Tower, drinking coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier, going over wire transfer records with Theodore Marsh. Frank's voice was lower than usual, the way it gets when something important has just moved. Marcus Delling just called his personal attorney, Frank said. A man named Howard Greer, 49 years old, criminal defense, practiced in Denver for 22 years. Marcus made the call from a handicapped restroom on the 12th floor. He was in there for 11 minutes. I set down my coffee cup. He knows we're pulling his files. He knows, Frank said, and I think he's scared enough to talk. I have thought about Marcus Delling many times since that day. He was 48 years old, heavy-set, with the kind of careful, measured voice that CFOs develop after years of delivering bad news to people who do not want to hear it. He had worked for Harlan Pruitt for 9 years. He drove a gray Audi. He coached his daughter's soccer team on Saturday mornings. He was not by nature a criminal. He was a man who had made a series of choices, small ones at first, then larger ones, and had woken up one September morning to discover that those choices had built a cage around him so tight he could barely breathe. Frank told me what happened next. Agent Webb and 2 field agents entered the CFO suite at 2:14 p.m. with a federal subpoena for all financial records going back 36 months. Marcus's assistant, a young woman named Carrie, turned pale the moment she saw the badges. She stepped back from her desk and pressed both hands flat against the wall behind her, as if the building itself might hold her steady. Marcus appeared in his office doorway 30 seconds later. His face, Frank said, looked like a man watching a house fire consume everything he had spent his life building. "Mr. Delling," Agent Webb said, holding out the subpoena, "we have authorization to image every hard drive on this floor." Marcus did not take the document right away. His hand went to his mouth instead, and he pressed 2 fingers against his lips and stood there for a long moment. Then Howard Greer arrived, a compact man in a charcoal suit moving fast down the hallway with a briefcase tucked under his arm, and he put a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder and steered him back inside the office and closed the door. Frank said the closed-door meeting lasted 44 minutes. When that door opened again, it was Howard Greer who spoke first. "My client would like to discuss terms of cooperation with the United States Attorney's Office," Howard said. He was calm, professional, the way defense attorneys are trained to be when they are trading a man's freedom for something more valuable. He has information material to the federal investigation of container MED-2247 and the associated wire transfers. He is prepared to provide that information in exchange for a formal use immunity agreement. I want to explain what use immunity means because it matters. Use immunity means the government agrees that anything Marcus tells them, every word, every document, every admission, cannot be used against him directly in a criminal prosecution. It is not the same as transactional immunity, which would have shielded him from prosecution altogether. Use immunity is narrower. It protects his words, not his actions. If the government could find the same evidence another way, they could still charge him. But in that moment, what the government wanted more than Marcus Delling behind bars was the truth about Vivienne Pruitt Hale and Wade Pruitt, and Marcus was the clearest path to that truth. Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Falk arrived at 3:05 p.m. She was 38 years old with short red hair and the kind of precise, unhurried manner that told you she had done this before and was not impressed by the size of the case or the names involved. She sat down across from Marcus and Howard Greer and laid a single yellow legal pad on the conference table. "Tell me what you know," she said. Marcus's hands were trembling so badly when he began that Howard Greer quietly reached over and pressed them flat against the table the way you might steady a child. Then Marcus started talking, and once he started, he could not stop. He told them everything. He confirmed that Vivian had approached him 14 months earlier, July 2023, with a restructuring proposal that she framed as a way to protect Harlan's empire from Vance Capital's tightening credit conditions. She had presented spreadsheets. She had been logical, persuasive, and utterly convincing. She had explained that the insurance claim on MED 2247 would generate $5.2 million that could be quietly redirected to stabilize Pruitt Logistics' balance sheet before the next quarterly audit. All Marcus had to do was approve 2 internal transfers and look the other way when the authorization codes were reassigned. He said he had told himself it was a one-time decision. Then he opened his desk drawer and removed a USB drive the size of his thumb. He set it on the table in front of Diane Falk with a hand that would not stop shaking. "Every internal transfer," he said, his voice breaking apart at the edges. "Every email, every authorization I approved. Timestamps, routing numbers, Vivian's written instructions. Wade's confirmation replies. I kept copies because..." He stopped, swallowed. "Because I knew this day was coming. I just did not know how soon." Diane Falk picked up the USB drive without hurry and placed it into an evidence bag. She labeled it, signed the label, and slid it across to her assistant to log into the chain of custody. She did not smile. She did not congratulate Marcus. She simply wrote something on her legal pad and asked her next question. "I was not in that room. Frank told me all of this in pieces over the following hours, and I sat with it the way you sit with something heavy that you cannot put down. My son had been made to look like a thief by people who had eaten at our table. The thought made something burn behind my ribs that was beyond anger. It was the particular kind of grief that comes when betrayal wears the face of family." At 4:15 p.m., my phone rang. Donna. My daughter is 38 years old, and she has her mother's voice steady until the moment it isn't. When I heard her say, "Dad, I just talked to Caleb," I could already tell from the way she said his name that she had been crying. "He's okay," I said. "He told me what Vivian did," she said. Then she stopped, and I heard her breath catch hard, and she said, "Dad, I stood up in their wedding. I carried her flowers." "I know, sweetheart. She used him." Her voice cracked open completely, then not a quiet thing, but the kind of sound that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded. "She used him from the very beginning, and I should have seen it, Dad. I should have..." "Stop," I said. "You listen to me. This is not on you. This is not on Caleb, you hear me?" She was crying too hard to answer for a moment, and I stayed on the line and said nothing useful and everything necessary the way fathers do. At 5:14 p.m., Frank called again. "Flight records just came back from Diane Falk's office," he said. "Vivian and Wade Pruitt booked 2 seats this morning. United Airlines, Denver International to Nassau, Bahamas. Departure 7:15 p.m. He paused. "Gate C32. I looked at my watch. It was 5:17 p.m. "Frank," I said. "Already called Webb," he said. "He's moving." I set down the phone and looked out the window at Denver spread below me in the late afternoon light, and I thought about a woman I had once welcomed into my family, and a man I had never trusted, and a gate at the end of a terminal where 2 people were right now walking with luggage and boarding passes, and the absolute certainty that they had gotten away clean. They had no idea what was waiting for them at gate C32. I want to tell you something about the particular cruelty of airports. Everyone in an airport is going somewhere. Everyone carries a version of themselves they have packed carefully into luggage, the person they will be when they arrive, the life waiting on the other side of the flight. Airports are built on the assumption of departure. They are not built for the moment when departure is no longer possible. Frank called me at 5:42 p.m. I was still in the conference room at Vance Capital, my jacket off my sleeves rolled to the elbow. The Cayman Islands wire records spread across the table in front of Theodore Marsh. When I saw Frank's name on the screen, I picked up before the second ring. "Webb has the warrants," Frank said. Judge Ashton signed both at 5:31 p.m. Wire fraud under 18 USC 1343 and money laundering under 18 USC 1956. He has 12 agents inside Terminal C right now. I walked to the window. The sun was dropping behind the Rockies, painting the glass orange and gold. And somewhere across that city, my daughter-in-law and her brother were rolling luggage toward Gate C32 with boarding passes in their hands, and the absolute certainty that they had gotten away clean. Frank had a contact inside the terminal, a TSA supervisor named Gerald, who owed him a favor, and Gerald was feeding him updates every 4 minutes. At 6:07 p.m., Vivian and Wade cleared the C concourse security checkpoint, moving at a normal pace, not hurrying, not looking back. The confidence of people who believe the door has already closed behind them. At 6:19 p.m., they reached Gate C32, United Airlines Flight 1847 to Nassau, on time. Boarding at 6:55 p.m. I thought about Caleb sitting somewhere in Denver with an ankle monitor and a borrowed phone, not yet knowing how completely this was already finished. At 6:34 p.m., Agent Webb moved. 4 agents in plain clothes from the East Corridor. 2 more at the gate door. 2 covering the exit. Wade saw them first. He stood up so fast he knocked his water bottle off the armrest. His knees buckled. He grabbed the chair back with both hands and made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a cry, the sound a man makes when the story he has been telling himself finally stops being true. Vivian did not buckle. She stood slowly, set her phone face down, and turned to face Webb with her chin up. Composed, certain, exactly the way she had looked at my dining room table 8 Christmases ago. Then the handcuffs appeared, and her composure came apart completely. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice stripped of every layer of elegance she had built over years. "Do you understand who my father is?" "Vivian Pruitt-Hale," Webb said, cutting through her words without effort. "You are under arrest for wire fraud and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Word for word. Unhurried. While her breath came in hard pulls and Wade stood with his head dropped and his shoulders shaking. Frank told me all of it afterward, his voice tight and careful. "Was she still talking when they walked her out?" I asked. "All the way down this corridor," he said. I hung up. I sat in the leather chair. Theodore looked at me across the table and did not ask the question, because my face had already answered it. "It's done," I said. "For tonight," Theodore said quietly. "The arraignment is Monday morning. Judge Ashton's docket, Federal Courthouse, downtown Denver." I looked at the city out the window, the mountains going dark behind it, and I thought that done and finished were 2 very different things. Monday was only the beginning of what came next. I want to tell you something about federal courthouses. They are built to make you feel small. Not cruelly, not the way a prison is built to crush, but deliberately, architecturally small in the way that reminds every person who walks through those doors that the institution they are entering is older and heavier and more permanent than any single life inside it. The marble floors, the high ceilings, the particular quality of silence that is not really silence at all, but the accumulated weight of 10,000 prior judgments pressing down on the present one. I arrived at the Byron G. Rogers Federal Building in downtown Denver at 7:48 a.m. on Monday, September 23rd, 2024. Frank Shepard was already waiting on the steps, hands in his coat pockets, watching the street with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who has spent 30 years noticing things other people miss. "Caleb's inside," Frank said when I reached him. "Donna brought him. They've been here since 7. I nodded and went in. The courtroom assigned to Judge Beverly Ashton was on the 4th floor. Courtroom 4. Dark wood paneling, 2 long gallery benches, a prosecution table already occupied by Diane Falk and her assistant, a defense table where 2 attorneys I did not recognize were arranging folders with the mechanical efficiency of people being paid by the hour. The room smelled of old paper and floor polish and the particular tension that collects in spaces where people's lives are decided. Caleb was sitting in the 2nd row of the gallery, with Donna beside him. When I came through the door, Donna saw me first. She stood up immediately, crossed the distance between us in 4 steps, and pressed her face against my shoulder and held on. She had been crying already, her eyes were swollen, her breath still catching in the uneven rhythm of someone who has not stopped long enough to recover. I put my arm around her and held her for a moment and said her name quietly, and she pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat down again without a word, because some grief is too large for words, and she had always known that. Caleb looked at me when I sat beside him. His face was thinner than it had been a week ago. The ankle monitor was hidden beneath his trouser leg, but I knew it was there, and I knew he knew I knew, and neither of us said anything about it because there was nothing useful to say. What I did instead was put my hand on his forearm for exactly 3 seconds, firm, deliberate, the way I used to when he was a boy, and had done something frightening and come through the other side of it. He pressed his lips together hard and looked back at the front of the courtroom, and his jaw tightened, and I watched him choose in real time to hold himself together. That took more courage than anything else I saw that morning. Judge Beverly Ashton entered at 9:02 a.m. She was a compact woman, 61 years old, with silver hair pulled back and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She moved to the bench without ceremony, and sat and opened the case file and put on her glasses and began reading as if the rest of us were simply furniture arranged for her convenience. I had been told she had served on the federal bench for 19 years. Looking at her, I believed every one of them. "United States versus Vivian Pruitt Hale and Wade Allen Pruitt," she said without looking up. "Case number 24-CR-0847, arraignment proceeding. Both defendants present. They were brought in through the side door, Vivian first, then Wade, both in civilian clothes, both escorted by federal marshals. Wade walked with his head down and his shoulders rounded inward, a man trying to make himself as small as possible inside his own body. Beside me, I heard Donna pull in a sharp breath. Vivienne walked differently. Her chin was up her back straight, and she scanned the gallery the moment she entered, not nervously, but with the measuring look of someone calculating who was present and what each face meant. When her eyes found me, they stopped. For 2 full seconds, she looked directly at me across that courtroom. I did not look away. Neither did she. Then a marshal touched her elbow and directed her to the defense table, and she turned her back on me, and that was the last time Vivian Pruitt Hale ever looked at me as though she had any power left. I want to explain what an arraignment is because people confuse it with a trial. An arraignment is not a trial. No evidence is presented. No witnesses testify. The arraignment serves 3 purposes. The charges are read aloud so that defendants hear them formally stated by the court. The defendants enter their initial pleas, and the judge rules on bail and conditions of release pending trial. Diane Falk read the charges in a clear, steady voice. Wire fraud under 18. USC 13434 counts for Vivian, 3 counts for Wade. Money laundering under 18. USC 1956, 2 counts each. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud under 18. USC 1349, 1 count each. As each count was read, I watched Caleb's hands in his lap. They were pressed flat against his thighs, and they were trembling not visibly to anyone who was not looking for it. But I was looking, and I saw them, and I felt something move through my chest that was equal parts heartbreak and fury, and the particular helplessness of a father who cannot absorb his child's pain on his child's behalf. Both defendants entered pleas of not guilty. Their attorneys had counseled them correctly. A not guilty plea at arraignment is standard procedure regardless of the evidence, because it preserves all legal options and allows time for defense preparation. It meant nothing about guilt. It meant only that the process was beginning. Then Diane Falk rose for the bail argument, and she was thorough, and she was precise, and she was devastating. She cited the $4.1 million wire transfer to a Cayman Islands account. She cited the Nassau flight booked the morning of the arrest. She cited Vivian's 2 international phone calls to a Nassau bank and a Miami travel agency. She cited Wade's Aurora storage unit, which federal agents had opened that morning, to find $340,000 in cash bundled in vacuum-sealed bags. She asked Judge Ashton to designate both defendants as flight risks and deny bail entirely. The defense attorneys argued financial ties to the community family connections, no prior criminal record. Judge Ashton listened to both sides without interrupting. Then she took off her reading glasses, set them on the bench, and looked at the defense table with the expression of a woman who has heard every argument available to human ingenuity and is not moved by any of them when the facts are this clear. Bail is denied for both defendants, she said. The court finds substantial flight risk on the evidence presented. Trial is set for January 13th, 2025. Both defendants will remain in federal custody pending trial. She looked at her calendar. We will also schedule a separate hearing regarding the civil asset claims against Pruitt Logistics. Mr. Harlan Pruitt. And here she looked directly into the gallery, where I now noticed for the first time that Harlan had been sitting 3 rows behind us, perfectly still in a dark suit, should ensure his own counsel is present for that hearing. November 4th, 9 a.m. Harlan said nothing, but the color left his face so completely that the man beside him, a lawyer I assumed, reached out and put a steadying hand on his arm. Caleb turned and saw his father-in-law in that moment. He stared at Harlan across the rows of gallery benches, and what crossed his face was not anger. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. The look of a man revising every memory he has ever trusted. Then Donna took Caleb's hand in both of hers and held it fiercely, and Caleb turned back to the front of the courtroom, and the gavel came down, and Monday was over. But January, I knew, was only just beginning to take shape. I want to tell you something about the months that follow a catastrophe. People imagine that once the arrests are made and the gavel falls and the news vans pack up and leave, the hard part is finished. It is not. The hard part is what comes after the long, unglamorous work of living inside the damage day after day, while the legal machinery turns at its own pace and the world outside continues as though nothing of consequence has occurred. Autumn in Wyoming is cold and honest and does not care what you are carrying. The elk come down from the high country. The cottonwoods go yellow. The wind off the bighorns has an edge to it that reminds you, in case you had forgotten, that the world is larger than your troubles. I spent most of October at the ranch. I had made a deliberate choice not to hover over Caleb during those months. He was 45 years old, and he had survived something that would have destroyed a lesser man. And what he needed from me was not my constant presence, but my consistent availability, the knowledge that I was there when he needed me and gone when he needed space. So I stayed in Sheridan. I called him every 3 days. I listened more than I spoke. That is, I have come to understand late in my life the most useful thing a father can do for a grown son. Frank Shepard kept me informed of everything else. The civil asset forfeiture hearing for Harlan Pruitt took place on November 4th, 2024, exactly as Judge Ashton had ordered. I want to explain what civil asset forfeiture means under federal law because it is frequently misunderstood. When a business is used as an instrument of fraud, when its accounts, its contracts, its physical assets are employed to move criminal proceeds, the government has the authority to seize those assets regardless of whether the owner is criminally charged. Harlan Pruitt had not been indicted. He was not facing criminal trial. But Pruitt Logistics had been the vehicle through which $4.1 million in fraudulent insurance proceeds had been routed, and the government's position was that the company's assets, its fleet, its warehouse contracts, its accounts receivable were connected to that fraud and subject to seizure. Harlan arrived at that November hearing with 3 attorneys. He left with a court order freezing every Pruitt Logistics account and a preliminary ruling that 23 of the company's 31 freight contracts were under review. Frank told me Harlan walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps for a long moment, in the November cold. And then he put his hand over his mouth, and his shoulders dropped forward, and he made a sound that Frank described as the sound of a man who has finally understood, at 70 years old, the full cost of what he allowed to happen inside his own house. I did not feel satisfaction at that. I want to be honest. Harlan Pruitt was a proud and selfish man who had chosen his company over his daughter's decency and his son-in-law's freedom. But he was also an old man watching everything he had built dissolve in a federal courtroom, and I am too old myself to take pleasure in another man's ruin. By December, Pruitt Logistics had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Chapter 7 under federal bankruptcy law is a liquidation proceeding, not a reorganization, not a second chance, but a structured dissolution in which a court-appointed trustee sells the company's remaining assets to satisfy its creditors. The freight contracts were terminated. The warehouse staff, 41 people in 3 states, received termination notices the week before Christmas. Elena Vasquez, the warehouse coordinator, fired 1 hour after Caleb was taken away under the pretextual reason of failure to report irregularities she had never been told about, called me in December. When Elena called, I could hear from the first syllable that she had been crying. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I just got off the phone with Diane Falk's office. They told me the federal filing includes a wrongful termination claim on my behalf, and that Pruitt Logistics insurance bond may cover back wages." Her voice broke completely at that point, and she pulled in a ragged breath and said, "I have a daughter. She is 6 years old. I have been counting change for groceries since September, and someone is finally—" She stopped, started again. "I just wanted to say thank you. I know you didn't have to. I didn't do anything." I told her, and I meant it. "You asked the right question at the right time. That took courage. Everything that happened after came from that." She cried for a little while longer, and I stayed on the line and let her, because some relief needs to come out before it can settle. Pastor Owen Briggs came out to the ranch on the 2nd Saturday of December. He is 68 years old, and he has known me for 31 years, since Margaret was still alive, and we were young enough to believe that faith was simple. He brought a thermos of coffee, and we sat on the porch in the cold, with our boots on the railing, and he did not ask me how I was, because after 31 years, he knows better than to ask questions he can already answer. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired," I said. "Different tired than usual." "Yes," I said. "Different tired than usual." He poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to me and said, "You did right by the boy." I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I thought about September and the drive down I-25 at 4 in the morning, and the courtroom hallway, and the 3 seconds I had pressed my hand against Caleb's forearm. I thought about Margaret, who had died when Caleb was 32, and who had never met Vivian, and who would have seen through her in the first 5 minutes of the first dinner, because Margaret could always see through people who were performing rather than living. I should have done right by him sooner, I said. I kept my distance too long. Thought he needed to find his own way. He did find his own way, Owen said. You just made sure the road was still there when he needed it. I did not answer that, but I held on to it. Caleb's ankle monitor was removed on January 8th, 2025, 5 days before trial. The conditions of his pre-trial release electronic monitoring, no contact with witnesses, daily check-ins, had been fulfilled without a single violation over 110 days. Theodore Marsh filed the removal motion on January 6th. Judge Ashton approved it the same afternoon. Caleb called me that evening. His voice was different. Not healed, healing is slower than that, but different. Lighter by some specific and measurable degree. It's off, he said. I know, I said. Theodore called me. Dad. He stopped. I heard him swallow. I need you in that courtroom Monday. I need to know you're there. I'll be in the second row, I said. Same seat as last time. He exhaled long and slow, and full of things that words are not adequate to carry, and I listened to it, and I thought that whatever came next in that courtroom, my son had already survived the worst of it. January 13th was 5 days away, and Dennis Okafor had just told Frank Shepard that he had found something in the Oakland Gate records that had not been in any of the original filings, something that would put Vivian's own handwriting on the authorization code. I want to tell you something about what it feels like to watch justice move. It does not move the way people imagine, not swiftly, not dramatically, not with the clean momentum of a story that knows where it is going. It moves the way a glacier moves, with enormous, inexorable weight, grinding everything beneath it into a shape it could not have predicted when it started. You sit in the gallery and you watch and you wait, and some days very little appears to happen, and other days something shifts so completely that the air in the room changes, and even the court reporter's fingers pause on the keys for just a moment before catching up. I sat in the second row of courtroom 4B for 13 days in January 2025. Caleb sat beside me every morning. Donna came when she could. She had a job and 2 children and a husband who held things together back home while she drove in from Aurora. But she was there for the days that mattered most, and she always found my hand when the testimony grew hard to hear. Diane Falk gave her opening statement on January 13th, a Monday. She stood before the jury, 8 women, 4 men, ages ranging from what I guessed was mid-20s to late 60s, and she spoke for 41 minutes without notes, walking them through the entire architecture of the fraud, from its earliest planning stages in the summer of 2023 to the moment the handcuffs went on at Gate C32. She was precise and she was relentless, and she used plain language throughout the way a skilled prosecutor does when she wants a jury to understand not just the facts, but the human cost behind them. She said, Vivian Pruitt-Hale did not steal a container. She stole her husband's name, his credentials, his reputation, and 3 years of his life. And she did it deliberately, methodically, and without a single moment of hesitation. Caleb's hand found the gallery railing in front of him and gripped it hard enough that I could see the tendons in his forearm go rigid. I did not say anything. I simply put my hand over his and pressed down once, and he loosened his grip by degrees. The defense opened on the afternoon of the 13th. Vivian's attorney, a tall man named Gerald Foss, 62 years old, silver-haired with the practiced ease of someone who has defended the wealthy for 4 decades, argued that Vivian had been a peripheral figure in a scheme primarily orchestrated by Marcus Delling, who had after all approved every financial transfer himself. He suggested that Marcus's cooperation agreement with the government had given him every incentive to redirect blame toward a more prominent defendant to secure his own protection. It was a reasonable argument. I will give Gerald Foss that. It was the argument I would have made in his position. Dennis Okafor took the stand on January 15th. He was 47 years old, and he had worked the Port of Oakland for 19 years, and he walked to the witness box with the careful dignity of a man who understands that what he is about to say will be scrutinized by people who will look for any weakness in it. He sat down. He adjusted the microphone. He folded his hands on the railing in front of him. Diane Falk walked him through the container records, step by step, the authorization timestamp, the retired access code Delta 7904, the external IP address, the overwritten camera footage. The jury watched him the way jurors watch a witness. They have decided to trust steadily, without looking away. Then she showed him the gate record that Frank and Dennis had found in December, the one that had not appeared in the original filings. It was a secondary log entry generated automatically by the port's backup system when the primary log was overwritten. It contained a digital signature field. That field was not empty. The signature read V. Pruitt Hale, timestamp 11:43 p.m., September 14, 2024. Dennis identified the signature format as consistent with the Pruitt Logistics Internal Authorization Protocol. He explained that the backup log could not be manually overwritten. It was written to a separate server maintained by a third-party port security contractor and was accessible only with credentials that Vivian had used twice before for legitimate authorizations in prior months. When Dennis said that last sentence, Vivian's attorney Gerald Foss wrote something on his legal pad with such force that the pen tore the paper. Across the courtroom, Vivian's composure, which had held for 2.5 days with a rigidity that I found both impressive and chilling, came apart in a single visible instant. Her jaw clenched. Her right hand gripped the edge of the defense table. She leaned toward Foss and said something urgent and low, and Foss put his hand out flat in a stop gesture without looking at her, and she pulled back and pressed her lips together hard. They went white. Dennis left the stand after 4 hours of testimony and cross-examination. When he passed the gallery on his way out, he did not look at Caleb. But Caleb looked at him and said quietly, "Thank you." And Dennis gave a single nod that carried more weight than most speeches I have heard. Marcus Delling testified on January 17th and 18th. He had lost weight since September. His face was drawn, and he wore a suit that no longer fit him quite right across the shoulders, the suit of a man who has spent 4 months shrinking inside his own life. He confirmed every financial transfer. He confirmed Vivian's written instructions. He confirmed the July 2023 meeting in which she had laid out the scheme with spreadsheets and timelines and the calm efficiency of someone who had been planning it for longer than that meeting. When Gerald Foss cross-examined him, he pushed hard on the immunity agreement, argued that Marcus was a man who had admitted criminal conduct and was now pointing fingers to save himself. Marcus looked at Foss for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was absolutely steady for the first time in 2 days of testimony, "I am pointing at the person who designed the crime, recruited me into it, and then tried to make sure I would take the fall alone. I am not pointing to save myself. I am pointing because it is true." The jury watched him say that. I watched the jury watch him. Elena Vasquez testified on January 21st. She was 34 years old, and she wore a dark blue dress, and she sat in the witness box with her hands folded and her chin up. And when Diane Falk asked her to describe the circumstances of her termination, her voice broke twice, but she did not stop, and she did not look away from the jury, and she finished every sentence she started. By January 24th, closing arguments were done. Diane Falk stood before the jury one final time and told them that the government had met its burden, that beyond reasonable doubt, the evidence showed a deliberate, documented, sustained conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering, and that the signatures, the transfers, the emails, the testimony of 2 cooperating witnesses, and the physical evidence recovered from Wade Pruitt's Aurora storage unit left no reasonable alternative explanation. Gerald Foss told the jury that reasonable doubt lived in the spaces between what could be proven and what was being assumed, and that Marcus Delling's testimony was the testimony of a man with everything to gain from placing blame elsewhere. Judge Beverly Ashton instructed the jury on the law, on the meaning of beyond reasonable doubt, on the distinction between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence, on their obligation to consider each count separately for each defendant. And at 3:47 p.m. on January 24th, the jury left the courtroom to begin deliberations. Caleb stood up when they left. He turned to me with his eyes red at the edges and his jaw working, and he said, "Dad, I don't know how to wait anymore. I have been waiting since September." "I know," I said. "Tell me it's going to be all right." I looked at my son, 45 years old, thinner than he should be, marked by 4 months of a weight no man should have to carry, and I told him the truest thing I knew. "Whatever that jury decides," I said, "you are already free. They took everything else from you. They did not take that." He pressed both hands over his face and breathed in hard, and his shoulders shook once, and then he pulled his hands away and straightened up and nodded. The jury had the case. All we could do now was wait for morning. I want to tell you something about the night before a verdict. It is the longest kind of night there is, not because anything is happening, nothing is happening, which is precisely the problem. The jury is sequestered somewhere you cannot reach, turning the case over in their minds, and you are in a hotel room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Denver, with the curtains open and the city spread out below you in the January dark. And there is absolutely nothing you can do except exist inside the waiting. I did not sleep. I sat in the chair by the window, and I drank 2 cups of coffee that went cold before I finished them. And I thought about Margaret. I do this sometimes when the weight of something is too large to carry alone. I think about what she would say if she were sitting across from me, and I listen to the answer as clearly as I can manage. That night, I heard her say in the particular dry and gentle way she had Conrad Hale, "You have done everything you can do. Now let the thing finish." So I let the thing finish. Frank called at 7:14 a.m. on January 25th. "Jury's coming back," he said. "Bailiff just notified counsel. Courtroom opens at 9. I put on my jacket and went downstairs. Caleb was already in the lobby when I got there. He was standing near the revolving door, with a paper cup of coffee he was not drinking, turning it slowly in both hands, watching the street outside with the expression of a man trying to memorize something ordinary before everything changes. When he heard the elevator, he turned, and the moment he saw my face, he crossed the lobby in 6 steps, and we stood together near the door, and I put both hands on his shoulders and looked at him directly. "However this goes," I said, "we go home after. You understand me." His eyes filled immediately. He pressed them shut hard, and 2 tears ran down his face that he did not bother to wipe away, and he said, "Yes, sir," the way he had not said it since he was a boy. And something in my chest broke open quietly, and I pulled him forward and held him for a moment with my hand at the back of his head, the way I had when he was small and frightened, and I thought, whatever else I have done wrong in this life, I got here. I showed up. That will have to be enough. Donna arrived at 8:20 a.m. breathless, her coat half-buttoned, her hair still damp from a rushed morning. She grabbed Caleb's arm the moment she saw him and said, "Tell me you slept." And when he shook his head, she made a sound of exasperation and love that only sisters can produce, and linked her arm through his and marched him toward the door. We were in our seats in courtroom 4B by 8:47 a.m. The room was fuller than it had been on any other day of the trial. Word had spread Jenna Albright was in the press gallery, with 2 colleagues I did not recognize, all 3 with notebooks open. Theodore Marsh sat 3 rows behind us. Frank Shepard stood along the side wall with his arms folded, watching everything with the patient attention he always brought to the moments that mattered. Vivian and Wade were brought in at 8:58 a.m. Wade looked as though he had not slept in several days. His face was gray, and his eyes were swollen, and he moved to the defense table with the mechanical shuffle of a man whose body is present, but whose mind has already gone somewhere else entirely. Vivian sat down with her back straight, and her hands folded on the table and stared at the front of the courtroom, and I could not read her face at all. I have known many kinds of courage in my life. I could not determine, looking at her in that moment, whether what she was displaying was courage or simply the last wall a person builds when everything else has been stripped away. Judge Beverly Ashton entered at 9:02 a.m. The room rose and sat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, stood and said, "We have, Your Honor." What followed took 11 minutes. The clerk took the verdict form. Judge Ashton reviewed it. The foreperson stood again. Each count was read aloud one by one, and after each count, the foreperson's voice was clear and unhesitating. Vivian Pruitt-Hale, wire fraud 18 USC 1343, count 1 guilty, count 2 guilty, count 3 guilty, count 4 guilty, money laundering 18 U.S.C. C1956, count 1 guilty, count 2 guilty, conspiracy to commit wire fraud 18 U.S. C1349, count 1 guilty. Wade Allen Pruitt, wire fraud, count 1 guilty, count 2 guilty, count 3 guilty, money laundering, count 1 guilty, count 2 guilty, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, count 1 guilty. With each word, Donna's grip on my arm tightened by degrees until by the final count she was holding on with both hands, and her face was pressed against my shoulder, and she was crying, not quietly, not the restrained kind, but the full, shaking, unguarded release of someone who has held themselves together and for 4 months, on pure determination, and has finally run out of reasons to keep doing it. People in the rows around us looked over. I did not care. I put my arm around my daughter and held her and let her cry. Caleb did not cry. He sat absolutely still through every count, his hands flat on his thighs, his eyes fixed on the foreperson's face. When the last guilty was read, he closed his eyes. His lips moved without sound, not words, I think, but breath, deliberate and slow, the kind of breathing a man does when he is making sure he is still real. Then he opened his eyes and looked at me, and what was in his face was not triumph, and it was not relief exactly. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. It was the look of a man who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. At the defense table, Wade dropped his head into his hands. His attorney put a hand briefly on his back and then removed it. Vivian turned her head. Not toward the jury, not toward the judge, toward Caleb. She looked at him across the width of the courtroom, with an expression I have turned over in my mind many times since that morning, and I still cannot name it with certainty. It was not remorse. It may have been something close to recognition, the acknowledgement finally of what she had done and to whom she had done it. Then a federal marshal stepped to her side, and she looked away, and it was finished. Outside the courthouse in the January cold, Jenna Albright found us on the steps. She had her notebook in her hand, but she did not open it. She looked at Caleb and said, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry it took this long." Caleb looked at her steadily. "It took exactly as long as it needed to," he said. "Write that down." She did. Frank appeared at my elbow as the crowd on the steps thinned. "Sentencing is scheduled for March 14th, he said quietly. "Ashton's clerk confirmed it this morning." He paused. "And there's something else. Theodore Marsh wants a meeting. Something about the Hale family holdings. He says you'll know what it means." I did know what it meant. I had been thinking about it since September. Since long before September, if I am honest. Since the first morning I stood on that porch in Wyoming and understood that I had been keeping my distance from my own life for far too long. It was time to stop keeping my distance. I want to tell you something about the difference between giving a man money and giving a man trust. Money is simple. You sign a document, a number moves from one column to another, and the transaction is complete. Trust is different. Trust is the thing you carry for decades and guard without speaking of it, and set down only when you are certain the hands receiving it are ready for the weight. I had been certain about Caleb's hands since September. The meeting with Theodore Marsh took place on January 28th, 2025, in a private conference room on the 32nd floor of Vance Capitol Tower. Theodore was 52 years old and had managed the Hale family trust documents for 11 years, and he laid the amendment papers on the table with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that what he was facilitating was larger than paperwork. Caleb sat across from me. He had not been told the specific purpose of the meeting, only that it concerned the family holdings and that his presence was required. When he walked in and saw the documents and saw my face, he stopped in the doorway and put one hand flat against the frame. "Dad," he said, "what is this?" "Sit down, son," I said. He sat. Theodore walked him through the amendment in plain language, the formal designation of Caleb Hale as primary heir and successor trustee of the Hale family holdings, effective immediately covering the Sheridan Ranch, the investment portfolio, and the 43% stake in Vance Capital that I had held quietly for 19 years. Caleb's hands began to tremble on the table in front of him. He looked at the documents, then at me, and his voice came out stripped of every defense a grown man builds around himself. "Dad, I haven't earned." "You have," I said. "You kept your integrity when losing it would have been easier. You told the truth when lying would have protected you. You did not run." I leaned forward. "That is exactly what this family needs in the person who carries it forward. That is exactly what I needed to see before I could do this." His chin dropped to his chest, and his shoulders shook once hard, and he pressed both hands over his eyes and breathed in the ragged, unguarded way that men breathe when something they have needed for a long time finally arrives. I reached across the table and gripped his forearm. "Sign the papers, Caleb." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He picked up the pen. His hand was still trembling when he signed his name, but he signed it clearly without hesitation, and that was all I needed to see. Outside the window, Denver stretched toward the mountains in the January light. I thought, Margaret, you would have loved this moment. I thought, we are not finished yet. We are only just beginning. I want to tell you something about coming home. Not the first time you come home that is easy, automatic, the body finding its own way back to familiar ground. I mean the second kind of coming home. The kind that happens after something has broken and been rebuilt when you walk through a door you have walked through 1,000 times and feel it differently, feel the weight of what it cost to still be standing on this side of it. Caleb drove up to the ranch on a Saturday morning in February 2025. I heard the truck on the gravel before I saw it, and I stepped off the porch and stood in the cold with my hands in my coat pockets and watched him climb out. He looked like himself again. Not the man who had gripped a courtroom railing with white knuckles, not the man who had signed papers with trembling hands himself. Shoulders back, eyes clear, the particular steadiness of someone who has walked through fire and come out the other side knowing exactly what they are made of. He crossed the yard and stopped 2 feet in front of me and said, "I've been thinking about what you told me, that I was already free before the verdict. And," I said, "you were right." He exhaled and his breath rose in the cold air between us. I just needed the verdict to believe it. I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed once hard, and he covered my hand with his, and we stood there in the February cold without needing anything more than that. Peggy Norwood called that afternoon, to tell me Elena Vasquez had received her first settlement payment, back wages, legal fees, and a formal letter of wrongful termination from the Pruitt Logistics bankruptcy trustee. Elena had called the office crying so hard Peggy could barely understand her, and had asked Peggy to tell me that she had enrolled her daughter in a new school and that the little girl had made 3 friends in the first week. I sat with that for a long time after Peggy hung up. Vivienne and Wade were sentenced on March 14th, 2025. Vivienne received 14 years. Wade received 9. I did not attend the sentencing. I had said everything I needed to say by being present for every day of the trial, and I saw no purpose in watching 2 people receive the consequence of choices they had made freely. I simply noted the date in my calendar and turned the page. Pastor Owen Briggs came out the following Saturday. We sat on the porch the way we always do, boots on the railing, coffee going cold, the bighorns going white against the winter sky. "So," Owen said, "is it finished?" I thought about September, and the drive down a 25, and the courtroom, and the papers Caleb had signed with a trembling hand, and the truck on the gravel this morning, and Elena's daughter making 3 friends in the first week. "No," I said. "It started." Owen smiled into his coffee cup, and the wind came off the mountains, and I breathed it in, and it was enough. I have told you this story because I believe it needed to be told. Not because it ends well, though. It does better than I deserved, but because the hardest lesson in it belongs to me, not to Vivienne, not to Harlan, not to anyone who stood in a courtroom and heard their name followed by the word guilty. The hardest lesson is this: I kept my distance from my son for years and called it respect for his independence. I watched him build a life inside a family that was quietly dismantling him, and I stayed in Wyoming and told myself he was grown and did not need his father hovering. I was wrong. Distance is not wisdom. Silence is not strength. I learned that at 65 years old, driving through the dark at 85 miles an hour toward a city where my son needed me, and I thought God gives you the people you love before he gives you the wisdom to love them correctly. Do not waste the overlap. So I will say this plainly, as one Grandpa Stories teller, to whoever is listening: do not do what I did. Do not wait for the crisis to close the distance. Do not let pride or stubbornness or the comfortable fiction of independence keep you from the people who carry your name and your blood and your heart into the future. This is the real family story, not the fraud, not the courtrooms, not the $50 million. It is a father who almost waited too long, and a son who held on anyway. These Grandpa Stories are never really about the villains. They are always about whether the family finds its way back to itself. In my experience, and I have considerable experience now, it usually does. But only if someone is willing to drive through the night. If this family story moved something in you, leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you longest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more Grandpa Stories like this, one stories about real choices, real costs, and the people worth driving through the night for, subscribe to this channel. We will be here. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. And a final word: before the next story begins, some of what follows contains fictional elements constructed entirely for the purpose of honest storytelling and the lessons inside it. If that is not the kind of content you are looking for, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings, and may you find exactly what you are looking for somewhere else.